Justice Clarence Thomas, the author of Nyserpa versus Bruin, is under attack yet again from the left wing in America. Let's get to the bottom of this contrived controversy when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and New York Times bestselling author. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so. Show your love for the Four Boxes of American Liberty and Frederick Douglass. Okay, folks, so you probably have been reading over the last few days a little bit of hubbub about attacks on Justice Clarence Thomas over allegedly failing to disclose things that he supposedly should have disclosed on so-called judicial disclosure forums about trips or other so-called gifts that he may or may not have received from a billionaire friend of his. That's essentially the gist of the attack. But the reality is there's nothing here as I see it, and nothing's going to change other than the continued attack on the current composition of the Supreme Court, because the left in America hates the fact that this court is trying to follow the original text and the original meaning of the Constitution, including the original text of the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms, and the left hates it for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is that they don't like the original Constitution. They want it to be interpreted differently in their favor, and they also like the fact that back in the day they used to control the Supreme Court, so when they could not get the democratic outcome they wanted on issues like abortion or gay marriage, they could just lateral the ball to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would make up a right to say that something was there when it wasn't actually there in the text of the Constitution. That is all gone with the current composition of the Supreme Court, which is full of people that are trying to get to the original meaning of the Constitution, including the original meaning of the right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment. But nevertheless, we want to talk a little bit about this controversy ginned up by the media in America and why you need to be aware of it, but you should not worry about it, okay? Let's go through the analysis real quick. Number one, nothing is going to change with the Supreme Court in light of this contrived controversy by the media. Why do I say that? Because there's no legal problems associated with what's going on here. The only way you can change the composition of the Supreme Court or to remove someone from the Supreme Court in particular is if they engage in what's known as a high crime or misdemeanor, which this clearly is not. There's no suggestion there's any kind of a crime here involving Clarence Thomas or any other member of the Supreme Court. So obviously no one will be removed or changed in any respect, at least because of this controversy, number one. Number two is we got to keep in mind that, of course, the left continues to attack this court. We know the leak of the Dobbs decision, the protest in front of Justice Holmes, the attempted assassination of conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the attacks on John Roberts' wife and her career in Washington, D.C. There's a whole list of these things that we're seeing over and over and over again, trying to discredit and intimidate, in my opinion, the Supreme Court into doing what the left wing wants. This has been an old sort of approach to the Supreme Court. It used to be done by virtue of giving good press to people like David Souter. So even though you had Republican picks to the Supreme Court, often they evolved to the left by virtue of good press from people like on the Washington Post editorial board and so on and so on. That is no longer the case with this court, and the left is very angry about this. The mainstream media is very angry about this, so they've gone to the next level. Such attack includes this one on Clarence Thomas. Now, let us continue on. The issue involving Clarence Thomas is allegedly that he accepted certain trips to a billionaire's property, a man named Harlan Crow, who I've never met. I couldn't pick him out of a lineup, but according to what I'm reading, he's a billionaire and is a longtime friend of Clarence Thomas going back 25 years and would invite Clarence Thomas over to his home or to property he owned, because Harlan Crow, at least according to reports, is a billionaire real estate developer, and that's going to be important for the next point I'm about to make as to whether or not any of his issues ever got before the Supreme Court. The answer is no, as best I can tell. So anyway, again, keep in mind that Supreme Court justices are perfectly allowed to have friends in high places, including billionaires. This is not unusual at all, I should note, and I want to put that into context. Just to give you an example, that Justice Stephen Breyer apparently had over 200 various trips that he disclosed. Stephen Breyer was worth, tens of millions of dollars. He had income in the nature of I think $6 or $7 million a year. Obviously, that's not what he got paid as Supreme Court Justice. John Roberts, also a very wealthy guy. So, you have a lot of money in and around the Supreme Court because the people on the court tend to be quite successful. They tend to be married to people that are successful. They tend to have resources, and they tend to be friends with rich people. So, for example, Justice Kennedy was known, and I don't know if he still does this anymore, but he used to travel to Europe literally every single summer to do seminars in Salzburg, Austria, among all these other famous justices all around the world. And no one cared. Everyone knew about it. No one cared. Not a big deal. Because again, if you're a Supreme Court justice, by virtue of the fact that you became a Supreme Court justice is usually a sign that you know people that are in power. Because if you don't know people in power and they don't know and like you, you're never going to get the job as a practical matter. That's just the hardcore reality of who these people are and who they interact with. And again, keep in mind, the second thing is I want you to keep in mind is, Harlan Crow is a real estate guy. And the reason why this is important, the first rule of real estate. It's called location, location, location. And what that means is that real estate and real estate deals and real estate law are very specific to localities. They're not about some national constitutional right. It's not about the Second Amendment. It's not about the First Amendment. What really is, when you do real estate deals, and I've been involved with many blown up real estate deals in the context of my legal practice in New York City, I can tell you this, the reality is that real estate deals are very local, and you're much more impacted by local zoning boards, local conservation boards, local politics, the mayor, the city council. You see what I'm saying? These sorts of issues are so localized that they never get anywhere close to federal courts as a general matter, and certainly never get close to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's just not the same. They get fought out in state courts and local courts with local politics almost always. So as a practical matter, there's no suggestion that Harlan Crow, who is Clarence Thomas' longtime friend, ever had any kind of business before the U.S. Supreme Court, and that makes a lot of sense because if you know anything about real estate litigation or real estate politics or real estate deals, very, very local, nothing to do with national politics as a general matter. I'm not saying that stuff at the national level can't impact real estate. Yes, conceptually it can, but as a general matter, you're just not going to see it at the Supreme Court. And in this case, there's no suggestion at all that Harlan Crow, who's Thomas's friend, according to the reports, that he had any case before the U.S. Supreme Court. He was ever an amicus before the Supreme Court, or ever had any interest in the U.S. Supreme Court in any real sense. By the way, according to reports I've read, Harlan Crow actually has given plenty of money to Democrats, including Kristen Sinema, who's the senator from Arizona. So it's not even clear this guy's a radical right-winger or anything like that. He's given money to Democrats as well, at least according to what I've read. That would suggest he's not exactly as hardcore as maybe people like to portray him, just to smear Clarence Thomas. Now, beyond this, I mentioned to you that other members of the Supreme Court have ample friends. Now, this is, to me, the height of hypocrisy if you look at some of these things. So, for example, there is a book out right now. You can Google this, called Dinners with Ruth. And you're like, what is Dinners with Ruth? Well, let me tell you what Dinners with Ruth is. There is a very famous NPR, the National Public Radio, NPR Supreme Court correspondent named Nina Totenberg. She's been covering the Supreme Court as, in my view, a radical left-wing journalist for decades. So she is a classic inside the D.C. Beltway. She doesn't like conservatives. She's a radical liberal journalist at NPR going back decades. So she writes this entire book called literally Dinners with Ruth. And what does she talk about? That's right. The reporter for NPR, one of the most important influential journalistic positions in the country when it comes to the courts, literally talks about how she had a multi-decade relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg when Ruth Bader Ginsburg sat on the United States Supreme Court. And they had dinner every week for much of this time. The whole book discusses how, and this is from the public relations materials that I received here from Dinners with Ruth, again, talking about Nina Totenberg in D.C. from NPR and her relationship with the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It talks about, quote, "This is an intimate memoir of the power of friendships as women began to pry open career doors and transform the workplace. At the story's heart is one special relationship, Ruth and Nina." Right? You think that matters? So, and it goes on and on talking about how Ruth Bader Ginsburg had this close relationship with this NPR reporter who, again, is really, in my view, a mouthpiece for the left wing in America. And they talk specifically about how during Ruth's last year, when she was still on the Supreme Court, they shared so many small dinners that Saturdays were, quote, reserved for Ruth in Nina's house. And on and on. And then she goes, of course, Nina Totenberg also goes on to talk about her longstanding relationships with multiple Supreme Court justices, including Lewis Powell, William Brennan, and Antonin Scalia, and Nina's own family, et cetera, et cetera. Again, there's nothing wrong with the fact that Nina Totenberg and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court justice, had a friendship and spent all this time together. But come on. Don't tell me that Clarence Thomas can't have friends that donate to Democrat or donate to Republicans, and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg can't be friends with a radical left-wing journalist at NPR, in my view. Right? It's the same concept. No big deal. Never has been a big deal. So don't let the current media cycle try to impugn the integrity of Clarence Thomas when all these other justices have friends. Let me carry on. Give you another quick example here. Now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was also friends with another person named Dwight Opperman, who was a very successful, wealthy man. He's no longer with us. Neither is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course. And Dwight Opperman was a very big investment guy. In fact, I think it was in something like 2002. He was like the 239th richest man in the United States, according to Forbes. He was on the Forbes 400 list of wealthiest Americans, and he was friends with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Again, it's perfectly fine if these justices have friends, and it's perfectly fine if their friends happen to be rich and influential. It's okay, not a big deal. So the fact that Clarence Thomas, had this 25-year friendship with Harlan Crow doesn't seem to say anything other than they're trying to use this and the change in the disclosure rules that are going into effect to somehow try to, again, attack the integrity of the Supreme Court. No different than when they leaked the Dobbs ruling. They protested in front of the justices' homes, or they attacked John Roberts' wife for her career in legal recruiting. So to close, I think I'm going to close with the actual words from Clarence Thomas himself as to why he said, there's no problem here. This is what Clarence Thomas wrote, quote, Harlan and Kathy Crow are among our dearest friends, and we have been friends for over 25 years. As friends do, we have joined them on a number of family trips during the more than quarter century we have known them. Early in my tenure at the court, I sought guidance from my colleagues and others in the judiciary and was advised that this sort of personal hospitality from close personal friends who did not have business before the court, that's key, did not have business before the court, was not reportable. I have endeavored to follow that counsel throughout my tenure and have always sought to comply with the disclosure guidelines. These guidelines are now being changed as the committee of the Judicial Conference responsible for financial disclosure for the entire federal judiciary just this past month announced new, bing, 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 new guidance. And it is, of course, my intent to follow this guidance in the future, period, close quote. Again, changing the disclosure rules is going on here, and another attack on Clarence Thomas, of which we've seen countless going all the way back to their efforts to keep him off the Supreme Court with the Anita Hill saga. So none of this stuff is new. It's just part of the ongoing attack on the integrity of the court to try to tear it down because the left wing does not like the current composition of the court. And just keep that in mind as you read all these stories. I'm sure the drumbeat will continue to attack this court because that's what the left does. But the good news is channels like the Four Boxes Diner here and other aspects of the media in America and other YouTubers, I think, are sharp enough to see through this, and I hope that you watching this video are as well. Okay, folks, hope you learned a little bit something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and we will see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.